Here's another show you can enjoy in the True Story FM family of entertainment podcasts.
What's up, Supernatural superfans? I'm Chrissy Lenz.
And I'm Nate McWhorter.
And we're the host of
Gank That Drink,
a supernatural drinking game podcast.
It's the podcast where we make up drinking game rules for a favorite episode of our favorite show, Supernatural.
We recap the episode for you and let you know how all of the rules played out.
Then we let you know the drinking game rules for the next episode, so you can play along.
Plus, members get every episode early and ad-free,
with some extra bonus content chit-chat at the end of each episode as a member exclusive.
So download Gank That Drink, a supernatural drinking game podcast, wherever the finest podcasts are available.
And or become a member at truestory.fm/gankthatdrink.
And when you're out there in the world saving people and hunting things,
you know, the family business.
Keep the Gank That Drink motto in mind. Be excellent to each other and party on,
dudes.
Ever wonder where the devil got his horns?
How about those cloven hooves?
Or that pitchfork?
Wasn't he an angel?
No, he was a snake.
No, he's the great red dragon.
No, he's the beast.
He's the prince of this world.
Prince of darkness.
Well, he's the prince of darkness.
Good morning, star lovelies. One of my names is Lester Ryan Clark.
And I sometimes go by Keenan Diaz.
And we're the hosts of the brand new podcast, The Devil's Details. What comes to mind when I say Lucifer?
How about Satan?
What about just the devil? How did the big bad of the Western world end up with so many faces? Join us as we dig up, decipher, and deconstruct the devil's many forms throughout history.
Take a guided tour with Dante through the 9 circles of hell.
Or revisit Satan's angsty bad boy years in Paradise Lost.
Learn the ins and outs of a Faustian contract.
Easier than a 1099, but with a hell of a lot more fine print.
Slither on over to The Devil's Details on True Story FM and join us in the diabolic discussion.
Love and hisses. Mwah! Didn't Al Pacino play him in a movie?
Are you sure that wasn't Robert De
I could
Niro?
have sworn it was Tim Curry.
That was Elizabeth Hurley.
Didn't he go down to Georgia at some point?
Welcome to CinemaScope, where we embark on a revolutionary journey through film history. I'm Andy Nelson, your guide on this quest to bridge genres, subgenres, and movements, ultimately deepening our understanding of them all. Today, we're diving into the audacious world of the French New Wave, a movement that shattered conventions and redefined the art of filmmaking. Join us as we explore the daring techniques, existential themes, and auteur-driven visions that characterized this groundbreaking era and discover its enduring influence on contemporary cinema. Embrace the rebellious spirit of the French New Wave as we uncover the secrets behind its legacy. Joining me today are two fantastic guests, well-versed in the Nouvelle Vague, or French New Wave. First, Richard Neupert, recently retired film professor from the University of Georgia. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
And we have Kelley Conway, professor of film studies from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Hello, Kelley.
Hello. Great to be here.
So let's just first start just learning a little bit more about both of you. Let's start with you, Richard. What first drew you to the French New Wave?
I was actually lucky. I grew up across the lake in Madison, Wisconsin, and really young in high school, I would go to college film series that they'd go and show all kinds of stuff. So I discovered it really as before even being an undergrad. Late in high school, I'd start to watch the latest Truffaut movies or Romer films or Godard films would be coming to the art house in town or on campus. You could go and see the older ones. So I kind of fell in at the time in the early 70s, mid 70s, when there was a really great trend of films by already established new wave filmmakers. And then I could go back because of the campus film societies and sometimes catch their first thing. So if I saw the latest Chabrol movie, I could wait, and then sometime they'd be showing Le Beau Serge or The Cousins. So I was really fortunate, and that led me to taking French classes, French conversation classes, and getting more interested in French culture because of the movies.
That's fantastic. Kelley, how about you?
I was less fortunate than Richard. I grew up in a tiny town in the middle of nowhere in Iowa. And we had a little theater in town, but there were no screenings of films by Godard or Rivette or Chabrol in my town. So I actually wasn't a cinephile as a kid. I was a big reader. But when I got to college, I took a class kind of randomly called Introduction to Cinema. And in that class, I saw films by Jean Renoir and Jean-Luc Godard. And it literally changed my life. It made me understand that it was possible to think deeply about movies. And, they were an art form like any other, but also not like any other because they were connected to a really complex, industry in a way that painting and sculpture are not. So I was intrigued by all of that, and I never looked back.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting to look into this movement and start seeing so many threads throughout films after this point, and like how it really ended up shaping and kind of moving a lot of different careers and just like the language of film in all sorts of different and interesting directions. As we start this, let's set up why the French New Wave is such an important part of history.
One of the things about studying a French film class or any film history class or intro to cinema class is often they put things not only under directors, but a lot of times also under movements. So you've got German Expressionism and the Soviets and Neorealism and the New Wave and then other new German cinema, etc. But somehow the French New Wave seems to excite, I think, students even more because it seems like regular people made movies. And the notion of the French New Wave, I think, has always been encouraging to young independent filmmakers, that these people who did these great movies were younger than usual. They didn't have many resources. They tried out new technologies. I think there are a lot of things about the French New Wave movies that continue to kind of inspire filmmakers and independent filmmakers. We have a new MFA program here. I've been teaching independent film. And it's really great to get them to also go back and look at other kinds of things and make connections to how somebody in 2024 might think about, I don't have much budget. How should I, where should I stage my characters? What kind of story should I tell? And a lot of times I just show examples from the New Wave and they find it inspiring. So I think that's, at least for me, it's that it was youthful, it represented its era and society, etc. But also it continues to really inspire people around the world. In short term, it inspired people in Brazil and beyond. But also I've met African filmmakers who were making feature films in the 1990s who said they were inspired by, 400 Blows and Breathless and things like that.
So Kelley, do you want to just tell us, like, for those who are tuning in who may not have really dug deep into the French New Wave, what is it? Can you give us a sense as to what it really encompasses? I know that's a big question.
It's a big question, and it's one that has received many different answers through the years. In large part, thanks to Richard Neupert's book, A History of the New Wave, where he did a complete revisionist history of the New Wave. So there are two ways of thinking about it. There's the old way. The standard story of the New Wave would look something like this. In 1959, a rebellious critic named François Truffaut picked up his camera and made 400 Blows. And all of his friends were making films too, including Godard and Rivette and Chabrol, Eric Romer. And they changed the face of filmmaking through their mode of production and through their risk-taking and their rule-breaking. That story is not false, but it has been deepened and told with more detail and intelligence by film scholars like Richard. And so what he added to the story was, well, first of all, there were more people involved in this movement than that core group of guys who wrote criticism for the important journal Cahiers du Cinéma. First of all, there's this whole other group of people that some people designate the left bank, referring to the left bank of the Seine River in Paris. And this would be Alain Resnais, Agnès Varda, and Chris Marker. And even though they were not critics for the Cahiers, they were part of the energy of that movement, and they were making extraordinary films themselves. But also, again, as Richard reminded us, the New Wave had influences completely outside of that generational group. I'm thinking of people like Jean-Pierre Melville, or they loved Robert Bresson. Bresson's films like A Man Escaped and Pickpocket. He was experimenting with the soundtrack notably, but also acting and all kinds of things. Melville had his own production company, right? He was making low-budget independent films well before other people started thinking about that. And then also, Jacques Tati was really experimenting with the soundtrack and other elements of film style before the New Wave came around. So there's been an expansion in the people that we think of as being associated with the energy of filmmaking in the 50s and 60s.
And yeah, Kelley's right. And there's also just this real cultural moment, because the French New Wave, it came from a term that was never first applied to movies. There really was a sense that the post-World War II generation in France, like in England and around the world, was different and sort of a subculture. But there were also new novels were coming out in France. You got Robert and these people breaking down psychological realism and having these really cool novels. And there's new theater with theater of the absurd. And people are saying, well, movies are so exciting in the 50s. Like, where's our French New Wave in films? And it really was this whole generation that even Express Magazine is trying to figure out who are the new wave generation, the people in their sort of late teens and 20s, and they had surveys to figure out who they were. So there was this whole excitement about, there was a new wave generation. And then pretty soon, that once they assigned a new wave to film by 1959, 1958, with these new young filmmakers and a burst of activity, then it started to get increasingly assigned to as a cinematic movement. But in general, it really is a big cultural shift. And I'll just say, what is the French New Wave also? It is hundreds of first-time filmmakers getting to make a feature film between the late 50s, 58, into mid-60s. So there's never been this many new people coming into the industry, making a first feature film with no professional background, anywhere in film history. And partly that's fueled by new producers, but it's also helped by the government, the French government, the CNC, which helps give loans and low interest funding to filmmakers. That helped fuel it as well, or there wouldn't have been this wave of hundreds of people helping each other. The government helped and new producers did, and a bunch of other issues really were behind it.
Yeah, I mean, and that's an interesting element because, I think we've seen in various countries, various times around the world, when there's government assistance, like really pushing the medium as an art, that it can really help grow it in a lot of really interesting ways. Sometimes a little more controlled depending on how the government is funding that. But I think that there are those times where you really see, I had an episode about Ozploitation a few episodes ago, and that was one of the interesting elements, like a lot of funding coming in from the Australian government that really kind of gave rise to a wide variety of films coming out at that particular time. You started talking a little bit about kind of like what was going on, like how the French government was helping and all of that, but let's kind of set the stage for where this came from. Like, what was the general mood in France that led to this changing in views and opinions of these filmmakers and wanting to tell these different stories? Because, they were seeing Hollywood films and the like. I know Truffaut had mentioned a film called The Little Fugitive, which is an American film that I think when you watch it, you can see where he might have been inspired to kind of do something like The 400 Blows. But obviously, the French were making their own films. So, what was the general vibe going on there that brought all of this around?
I think we need to take the story back to the post-World War II moment, in fact, because, as important as these individual directors were, and they were bold artists who wanted to tell new stories and use new stylistic and narrative conventions. But there's a lot of background factors that helped make this possible and helped create a situation in which people felt like they could and should do it. So after World War II, so remember, the German occupation ended in 1945. But the Germans had controlled nearly every aspect of French society, including the film industry. One of the first things they did was control the film industry, set up their own production company called Continental, and churn out films. So they understood that film could be an important part of what they hoped would be the new German. That did not come to pass. So the new Germany, rather. But after the war, the French felt strongly that they needed to think carefully about what their national identity was and how do you rebuild an industry? How do you rebuild a country, in fact? Also, they needed to compete with Hollywood because after the war, Hollywood released a huge slew of films onto the French market, which made it hard for the French film industry to stay healthy and viable financially. So the French government actually started these aid mechanisms in the late 40s. I think in 1949 was the first one. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Richard. And then they had another set of government aid packages in 53 and then another in 59. And they were really thinking, do we just reward people who have already made a successful film and give them money for their next film? Or do we give filmmakers money up front? And who should get them and how? And so there was a lot of thinking and shifting about how you support a film industry. But there was also, there were these kind of extra textual, extra director factors, like the government's sense that the nation needed to be rebuilt. Film culture was really vibrant at the time. And by that, I mean institutions like the Cinémathèque Française, launched in 1936 by Langlois, but revitalized in the post-war period. So there, people had a screening space, an archive, and eventually a museum. There were film societies, or what they called ciné clubs, this vast network of clubs where ordinary people, teachers, college students, shopkeepers would get together every 2 weeks or every month and watch movies together and then talk about them. This was really an institutionalized film going and film discussion. So that was a really exciting thing. They actually had massive federations, I think 4 or 5 different federations of ciné clubs from multiple political, cultural perspectives. So that was a really rich sector of the French film culture. In other words, an audience was ready and waiting to embrace the experimentation of the new wave. So I would say, yeah, film mechanisms like institutional mechanisms like funding and film culture and the Cinémathèque. Film festivals were really vibrant. The Cannes Film Festival had tried to launch in 1939, but the war stopped that. The festival came back to life in, I think it was 1947, and other festivals launched. So there was a really vibrant film culture that helped set the stage for this. But I don't know, Richard, maybe you can talk about why people would have even wanted to make new kinds of films. What was the problem with the French film industry in the 50s, despite the aid packages, despite the rich film culture?
Well, you do a great job of setting the floor there and setting the foundation. Yeah, because one of the things that that then this new generation of kind of film goers and spectators is being taught to look for are alternatives. So yeah, the nation wanted to give money to big budget movies to help compete with Hollywood, but with real French themed. And that became lots of novels, The Red and the Black, Balzac. Things would be adapted for big budget French equivalents to Hollywood to compete with Hollywood. And that didn't necessarily please this new younger generation. So there was this sense that, okay, they might like Hollywood movies. I mean, they loved Howard Hawks and Hitchcock, etc. But they didn't want to see France as just competing with mainstream melodramas and stuff. So you're building this new audience, but you also have these new critics. And so along with the cine clubs, there are new journals coming along. So Cahiers du Cinéma, Kelley mentioned, Positif. The Cine Club group has something called Cinema that changes its name every year by adding the name. So it's Cinema 57, 50, 58, 59. And you've got this whole new generation, not only of people watching movies and reading about them, but writing about them. And that's where Truffaut gets going in the 50s. Jean-Luc Godard writes criticism. Eric Romer writes criticism. Chabrol's involved with it. So you get this young generation who, as Truffaut and Godard, they both almost said the same thing once, which was, when we're writing criticism, we were already thinking like film directors. They were critiquing movies, not just in terms of the story, but also in they didn't like the camera placement or the cast and crew. But they would praise other things. So there became this real attention to storytelling, film style, mise en scène, the visual directing style that was kind of brewing. And so there became this kind of, within the popular press, a celebration of these big national successful movies. But then in the cinematic, the sort of cinema buff, cinephile press, they were celebrating the French movies that didn't fit those norms, the Jacques Tatis, the Bressons, etc. And they were kind of looking for their own new generation. So the film festivals are picking up on movies that are very different than the #1 movies playing in Paris for the weekend from France. And that led to this kind of schism. And a lot of the young writers were saying, they used a bunch of really ageist phrases that French cinema is going through a sclerosis, that, there was this mocking. Yeah, in my book, I've got this great cartoon I found where there's a pregnant young woman who's got this fetus and this little boy inside her kicking at the old man who's in front of her, trying to already kick the old generation out of the way. So there's this real brash sense of move out the old guys, get rid of daddy's cinema, and create one of our own. And that led to some of this excitement. It's like, identifying new people. Like suddenly Louis Malle comes along, and Roger Vadim makes a pretty classic looking movie, but because it had Brigitte Bardot and a new kind of sexuality, and it didn't have the old makeup and wigs on and stuff, it looked new and fresh and honest. So there's this real sense of looking for something authentic rather than studio shot movies with lots of makeup, people theatrically trained who stop, make their speech and move on. They wanted something more lively.
Also, we can't forget the influence of Andre Bazin, right? So Bazin helped launch the film journal Cahiers du Cinéma, but his way of thinking about cinema was hugely influential on these people. He was, first of all, he loved Italian neorealism and wrote about it with great eloquence and insight. And he also appreciated certain kinds of Hollywood films that used deep space, long takes. He really got people thinking about style in a fresh way. Even if the new wave directors like Godard and some others didn't necessarily make films like the ones they were championing in the pages of Cahiers, they all, in part thanks to Andre Bazin, were really attuned to visual style, shot duration, staging versus editing, a new, fresh kind of realism that, was partly inspired by the Italians. He was really crucial.
Well, and it's such an interesting way to see like the film criticism becoming so key to reshaping that, because film critics exist in all over the place, and I think that rarely do you find that sort of passion in a group of critics that ends up pushing into actual filmmakers and kind of just saying, this is what we're complaining about with all of these films. Let's just go do it ourselves. And I think it's so inspiring to kind of see them have that drive and passion to kind of push for that shift themselves.
No, that's a really good point. And Kelley's right. That somebody like Andre Bazin made them think about style and argue, but he's not trying to say everybody should make the same kind of movie. And I think that's what's really important. They didn't have a cookie cutter and say, now we all have to make things that look like neorealism, but rather they have to really think about, when do you want to cut? Where do you put the camera, etc. It was a really good point.
And that, I suppose there's an element of this that leads to a conversation that ties into the auteur theory, which is kind of a part of this conversation, because it certainly had its rise with a lot of these voices as they were talking about it. And the idea that the director is really the author behind it, they really pushed that as far as talking when they were looking at Hollywood's films with John Ford and Howard Hawks and Hitchcock, about how they're really the authors. Like it's that central authorial voice behind those films, regardless of the studio. And I think that was another element here, because we're looking at all of these different filmmakers. They're definitely making different types of films, and they have their own language. And I think that's what's another interesting element that is important with this conversation.
They really wanted to make films and maintain their own freedom to develop their authorial style. That was part of it. It was like it was an issue of power, I would say, on the one hand. They didn't want to be cogs in a machine. They didn't want to work as an assistant director to someone else in the French studio system for 20 years before being able to pursue their own vision. And they celebrated those Hollywood filmmakers like Hawks and Ford and Hitchcock, who somehow managed to rise above the constraints of the industry and make their own mark, create their own distinctive signature. So they appreciated that, and they wanted to do that. And they really wanted to, when I say it was a power issue, they were really against screenwriters having the last say in what a film should look like. I don't even know if that was happening in the French film industry, but they complained a lot about screenwriters and their excessive connection to authorship of the film. And so, they really did go a long way in helping us perceive the film director as an author, as an artist, as someone who deserves autonomy in the creation of the work.
Yeah, and if you're going to be a young person who's trying to get into the industry or at least make your own movie that you want, you're not going to get standard producers to support you. A lot of them didn't write conventional scripts necessarily in the same way that other people did. So that's why they're going to need to shoot cheap. And they're going to look at Italian neorealism and look at other places. How did they make movies with almost no electricity and money right after World War II in Italy? How can we shoot in Paris? So they were inspired by other people around them. But Kelley's right. They had their own auteur individual reasons to want to do this stuff. So that even though Chabrol and Godard and Romer and Truffaut were all really good buddies, they never wanted to make movies that looked like each other. They wanted to all be authentic in their own way. So they might shoot on location because they can't afford a studio very much, but they'll shoot in different kind of places. They're going to go off to little towns or shoot in their neighborhoods or in their own apartments. But they're all going to kind of tell stories that are important to them that they all feel are somehow, again, honest for their generation.
And what's nice about that is they all had that desire to tell their own stories, but they were all also they all had each other's backs, and they all worked together. You're watching these films and it's like, oh, I recognize that guy. They're in each other's movies as bit players and everything. So you could tell, okay, they were probably all helping each other out. Hey, I just need I need a hand to help me with this thing. And you can just see them all kind of working together throughout. And even some of the actors, what is the actor? One of our actors that is he was in 6 of the movies that we watched. And I'm like, oh, well, that's because he was just a guy walking through a door in one movie and stuff. But it's clearly they had kind of this group that was just very passionate about telling their own stories.
They really had a big impact on evolving styles of acting. But also, I can think of one exception to what we've just described here, and that is Agnès Varda. She made her first feature she shot it in 1954. It came out in 1955 in a very limited run, La Pointe Courte. She was not part of that Cahiers gang initially. She didn't write criticism. She hadn't even seen a lot of films. She was a photographer and she loved art and art history and modernist literature. She drew on a slightly different set of influences. Notably for her first film, she used actors from the theater company that she worked for as a photographer, the Théâtre National Populaire, the National Popular Theater. So, but again, your point is rely on your friends, bring them in, pay them very little or nothing at all, and let's put on a show together. We can make this happen on a low budget.
No, it's inspiring to see.
Kelley's example is perfect. La Pointe Courte by Varda in 1954. She does bring in some people she's met through theater to be her 2 actors. One of them never made a movie before, but Philippe Noiret went on to become one of the great French actors of all time. This generation is preparing the next generation's stars. But also the other half of her movie, she's shooting people just doing their regular jobs. She like a neorealist. She just goes out and shoots normal people who aren't really acting. So it really challenged the whole notion of what is a performer at a time when, again, usually people wore lots of makeup and costuming. And these people were trying to get rid of costume designers on their sets because that's too expensive. As well. But yeah, in general, it is an auteur movement, but you're right, Andy, that they're helping each other out so that, Godard his producer is going to say, do you know anybody else who wants to make a movie? He says, yeah, Jacques Tati's got a script. Or Truffaut is going to give an idea to Godard to make Breathless. They're helping each other out. They're helping finance each other's movies. Claude Chabrol inherits a little money, starts his own little production company because Louis Malle had done the same thing a couple of years earlier and it worked. He's going to lend money to Romer and Rivette to help make their first movies. So it's a whole bunch of buddies working together outside of any kind of studio system. They're their own producers, except for a couple of really important people who do help them out, but also going to rely on the state funding and things like that to minimize the risks that are going on during this time also.
Yeah. An element that I suppose is just worth discussing is, mentioning Varda's early film and some of these films, the film movement has kind of been cordoned off, I guess we'll say, through, I don't know who or how it ends up kind of being described this way, but 58 to 62 is kind of like the rough window that generally you say, this is kind of the window of the French New Wave. But obviously, talking about that early Varda film, there were already these rumblings. So what is it that makes that particular window? Is that just the core window when most of these movies were happening?
Yeah, I think a lot of this comes together because, like, Melville's making a movie independently, Varda's doing that, Louis Malle's going to start doing that, but it's not quite a wave yet. It's just some independent jeune cinema, they call them, young new filmmakers. What really helps is the publicity of cahiers starting to reinforce each other, some chance of certain people getting certain money. Truffaut marries the daughter of a very wealthy film distributor. That helps him make his first short and then his feature film. At the same time that Chabrol has just inherited money, these new producers start to see, wait a minute, this guy made a $60,000 movie and it's making a couple $100,000 movies. I should start making movies. And the other thing that I discovered in my research is in 1959, the French franc was devalued strongly. And suddenly, for foreigners, it was like their currency is worth 20% less. So now an American or a Canadian or a German can actually a distributor can take a risk on a French movie at a 20% discount. So a lot of these movies they start to hear about, it's actually easier for small distributors now to pick these up. So even if Warner Brothers kind of people don't want to risk them, small distributors do. So there's a whole bunch of different factors. The French government changes its rules and is a little more open to giving money to first-time filmmakers. There are a bunch of different reasons that it becomes really a wave. And it's also the fact that they're all making a hell of a lot of movies. I mean, like Chabrol and Godard it's not unusual if they make 4 movies in 2 years. In 1959, Claude Chabrol premiered 2 feature films. Beau Serge comes out in January, wins a big prize. And in March, The Cousins comes out, and that goes on to be the number 5 hit in all of France that year. So the wave is also, they're constantly making movies. Godard's the one who says, if you're not directing a movie today, you're not a film director. Like, you can't just make one movie and then wait for a while and think of the next one. You're constantly, so they're working frenetically and they're getting their friends too, and it's expanding. And that's why there's this burst of the number of new feature films by first-time filmmakers. And those guys, whenever they can, keep making movies as well.
As you say, they had extraordinary energy and they were also prolific. But also I'm thinking, as you say, the publicity through film criticism was really important for them. And also I'm thinking about the importance of film festivals. I think Truffaut was rejected. He was kicked out of the Cannes Film Festival in 58
Oh, wow.
because he'd been so rude in his criticism and about filmmakers. And then in 59,
I thought Cannes was the festival for people to be rude, right?
Yeah, well, that's it. We're not even going to talk about Lars von Trier, but no, wait, maybe I've got my dates wrong. I think...
No, it's true. No, it's true. He didn't get a press card. They wouldn't give him a press card.
That's right. They wouldn't give him a press card. And then the next year, 59, wasn't it, Richard?
Yes.
He's back with 400 Blows, his own first feature. And then Hiroshima Mon Amour is also there at the Cannes Film Festival in 59. And then in 60, it's Breathless. So once they took over, they stormed the gates of the Cannes Film Festival. They were in.
That's just fantastic. And as far as 1962, is that because they were filmmakers and they kind of had I don't know, they're in the industry and it hits a point where suddenly it's like, well, now you're kind of just a filmmaker. You're not necessarily the new, fresh filmmaker that you were. So now you're just making things like Fahrenheit 451. Oh, we don't know if we were going to call that one French New Wave anymore. So, I mean, is that kind of like what happens? Like why we ended at 62? And I know it's kind of rough, but I mean, I'm just curious about that ending that they say.
Kelley, where would you end it? I usually say 64, but there's not really an absolute.
I think there are different ways to think about it. We could just look at, as Richard does in his book, I think he looks at the number of first-time films by young directors. That falls off. Some people like to think about the new wave as extending to May 68 when the political culture changes dramatically. There are lots of demonstrations and people become increasingly political in their filmmaking, which was different from how the new wave started. But I think my inclination is to have a very expansive definition of the new wave and ask whether, it even ended ever. Because these folks set up, it's an extreme view, I know, but these folks established a way of working and a way of talking about films and a way of promoting their work and a way of foregrounding their vision that persists to this day. And of course, they all kept making films.
No, it's a good point because for some people, everybody who ever made a new wave film is always a new waver. And that's where you define, is it a movement? Is it a cultural moment? Or is it a bunch of people? And I try to get away from it just being people. But for a lot of people, for a lot of French critics, they're always looking for, is this a new French new wave? Is this a new French wave in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s? They're still looking for a new one. But then Chabrol's out there being called the greatest French filmmaker of the 1990s, and they're still going on Godard. So yeah, it's really hard to say. But to me, yeah, they're not new anymore by 62, 64, 66. And the number of new filmmakers, Kelley's right, does drop off. So the conditions have changed by the mid-60s.
Well, and like you're saying, on this show, I often talk, when we're talking genres, talking about the cinematic family tree, like where does that genre fit? And, movement is a lot different than that. But it's interesting to look at like the different genres. I mean, even with the films we're going to talk about, there's a variety of genres we're looking at. We've got kind of this, some very personal dramas that we have. We've got a film that feels a little more like a crime thriller with Elevator to the Gallows. And so we've got romance with Hiroshima Mon Amour. So even like within the movement, these filmmakers are playing around with all these different genres. And it's just fun to see what they're bringing to them because they certainly all feel different.
Yeah, good point. There's a lot of variety in terms of both the ways in which these filmmakers are using the conventions of genre and then departing from them in radical ways, and also their style, editing, cinematography, mise-en-scène, soundtrack. They're really experimenting with those elements of style, but in different ways from one another.
Yeah. Yeah, and we'll definitely talk about some of that. At this point, let's start talking about the films themselves and jump into them. And then as we talk through each of them, we can talk about what that particular director brought to the new wave, some of the different techniques they used, etc., and really kind of dig into this a little bit more. For everyone tuning in, we're going to be discussing Louis Malle's Elevator to the Gallows, François Truffaut's The 400 Blows, Alain Resnais's Hiroshima Mon Amour, Jean-Luc Godard's Breathless, and Agnès Varda's Cleo from 5 to 7. And remember, we will be discussing an additional 5 films from the movement in our member bonus segment at the end of the show. Those films are Claude Chabrol's The Cousins, Jacques Rivette's Paris Belongs to Us, Jacques Rosier's Adieu Philippine, Jacques Demy's The Umbrella of Cherbourg, and Eric Romer's Claire's Knee. So if you want to hear that full conversation, you can learn more about becoming a member at truestory.fm/join. Okay, so as we discuss each of these films, let's talk about what stands out in the film that makes it French New Wave. And, per the auteur theory, as I said, let's talk about what each director brings to the film, some of their trademarks and everything. So starting with Louis Malle in 1958, Elevator to the Gallows. This is a French crime thriller starring Jean Moreau and Maurice Ronette. This film follows Julien Tavernier, who murders his lover's husband and then becomes trapped in an elevator while fleeing the scene. Meanwhile, his lover, Florence, she's wandering the streets of Paris trying to figure out where he is. And then at the same time, there's a young couple who actually steals his car, and they go off on their own little mini crime spree, and it leads to a whole bunch of complications in the story. So let's start with this one. It's a fascinating film, and we're already starting in a place where we're looking at themes of isolation, guilt, this psychological toll of crime. On top of all of that, the cinematography, fantastic score by Miles Davis. Lots of things to discuss with this one. And then Louis Malle isn't a director that we rattled off in our list of a lot of those prominent directors.
That's a good plot summary. And then there's also the German couple thrown in with their Mercedes. But anyway, yeah, it's an almost chaotic script in some ways. In other ways, it's very controlled. I'll just say that, yeah, Louis Malle had started out doing documentary film working with Jacques Cousteau. He was a super rich kid. Okay, this is his family had lots of money, the big sugar company, but it's not like he wanted to make movies like a rich person. He made a really inexpensive film. He bought his own production company. He fit within a low budget to make this. He had a brilliant cinematographer, Decay, who could work in low lights. So we should say a little bit more about the techniques, which is a lot of what they're doing here is trying to avoid studio sets, with 3-point lighting and then standard establishing shot reverse shots. So longer takes and less lighting are cheaper to stage, etc. So he's doing that stuff, but he's also really into genre films. Film noir in the United States, had been defined by the French. They're doing a lot of low budget detective movies of their own. So he makes kind of a stylish detective film or a crime drama that's got kind of tongue-in-cheek. Your main character is stuck in an elevator for the whole movie as well. So it's really a stunning movie on lots and lots of levels. One of the things that's important, he also had a good buddy who was into the arts and music, who knew about Miles Davis being in town. So he gets Miles Davis to come over, and in one night in the studio, in the production studio, they showed clips of the scenes, and Miles Davis and his band just spontaneously ad-libbed music to these images. And so there's 18, 20 minutes of non-diegetic music from Miles Davis in it, but it's some of the most striking images in French filmmaking, with Jeanne Moreau walking along the street, sometimes talking to herself. You can see her lips moving, but you just hear this kind of sad, thoughtful, mournful music. So it was really a radical thing. And I think it's on the DVD, there's a release of the French television series. The French television sent a crew over there. This was such an unusual production that they actually had a crew there that one night interviewing him in the control booth while Miles Davis is behind the glass, playing his trumpet to the silent film that they're looking at. And they're just explaining, this is a brand new way to make movies. So it was already part of the press too, that here's this young guy. He goes on to win the Deluc Award. Yeah, the Louis Deluc, which is one of the top awards for innovative filmmaking. He's 25 years old. His movie comes out and he gets the Louis Deluc Award. And everybody who's ever written about Miles Davis said this was a turning point in his career, that it really made him rethink the visuals in his music. So biographers of Miles Davis point to this movie, film people point to it, and a lot of the critics said, look, Louis Malle blew the doors open for what would become later the French New Wave. It's a really important movie on lots of levels.
I love this film so much, and every time I show it to my students, they just can't believe how cool it is. For me, the strategy that Malle uses that evokes new wave filmmaking the most would be those moments that Richard already mentioned, in which Jeanne Moreau wanders through the streets of Paris at night. And I think we can believe Henri Dequet, the cinematographer, when he says that they used only available light. So he really had figured out how to use sensitive film stock. I think he used Tri-X film stock at that time, and then used the light from the cafes and the bars and the street lights to illuminate the scene. So that was radical. But also just the idea that you could take a film that was about a killing and these scrappy young people who steal a car and they're off on their own journey. I mean, these are elements of genre that we've seen before. But the fact that Louis Malle could just sort of stop the narrative and ask us to watch Jeanne Moreau wander and think and worry and talk to herself in nocturnal Paris to the music of Miles Davis. I mean, it's just stunning. And it's just this moment to breathe and think and feel. And I just think it's brilliant, a brilliant choice.
One of the other elements of this, from my understanding, is that as far as Jeanne Moreau, and I apologize, you two both have much better French accents than I do. I never studied French, so mine is going to be a very American. But as far as her look in the film is without makeup and just kind of very natural look. You had mentioned not having costume departments, but also hair makeup. They were just having them look like themselves, and seeing someone like Jeanne Moreau on screen who hadn't been made up to look like, a movie star on the screen was also kind of a new thing that people were not used to. She just looked like a real person walking through the streets.
It's a really good point, and Kelley might want to build on this. But yeah, there's this sense that somebody like Jeanne Moreau, she had done theatrical acting more. She'd been in some movies, but a lot of people had told her, you're not very pretty. You can't be a leading lady in movies, but on stage with lots of makeup and far away, you can. And here within a couple of years, she and Brigitte Bardot are the two top women actresses in France. So yeah, you're right. They did away with all that. It's also another one of those wave boy things that Louis Malle and she started a relationship during this movie. And then they were still together when they made their next movie, The Lovers. So it became also this, there's a romantic aspect to it as well. But yeah, she really did an amazing, amazing job and was liberated. And I think a lot of young women, a lot of people talk about the sexism of the new wave, but a lot of these actresses really found that they didn't have to play the usual kind of role and look the usual way and have the usual lighting, and they could represent a new generation. So no, it's a really daring use of the female body in lots of ways, and it's it's just a really meandering movie. And the fact that you got jazz for a script that's not carefully controlled is going to be typical of a lot of the new wave films to come. They're not going to have the sort of controlled soundtracks because you got characters who wander. Your music should be loose as well. So for a lot of people, jazz became the soundtrack of the new wave.
Also, I think it shows how immediately affecting it can be even in Hollywood. I just rewatched Anatomy of a Murder last night, and there's a Hollywood film with a fantastic jazz score running through it, right, with Duke Ellington. I mean, it's just interesting to see how quickly these influences can happen, and I think that's one of the things that's so exciting about the industry and just how global it can be, and how welcoming people are to these ideas.
No, that's true. That's very true.
We get, as far as the kind of the camera work and everything, I think, you already mentioned the great cinematography, but I mean, you're getting like some great deep focus and long takes, and like a lot of those long takes, like on the street and everything. And that's also another important element that we're going to see kind of continue throughout these films. There's a lot of that sense of allowing the camera to live a little bit more. Well, I say that, then of course we'll be talking about Breathless soon, but I mean, there certainly is that element that we see in a film like this.
No, that's really true. The long takes, and Kelley can mention, right? You don't have professional actors who've been trained necessarily hit their mark. So you kind of stay back and let them move and watch them with longer takes.
Right. And I think also this kind of goes back to Bazin celebrating the long take and depth staging. But yeah, as you say, Andy, but they're perfectly capable of departing from that long take style and using very brief shots, as we'll see when we talk about Breathless. And so I think it's just a willingness it's just really hard to generalize about the style of these films because there's so much diversity in it, and they're just really exploring. They're constantly exploring and experimenting and thinking, well, what does it mean to tell this story? How can I tell it differently? How can I refresh the codes of editing? What happens if I shoot the main couple of breathless in bed for a full 1/3 of the film and nothing really happens? Let's try it. They were just very open to experimentation.
Yeah.
But also Louis Malle, I just think Louis Malle in this movie and Lovers, he really is taking literary notions of internal monologue and trying to figure out how to do it. The soundtrack comes and goes, and people don't celebrate his movie the way they do Godard and Resnais. I mean, there are times when characters are speaking and suddenly you just don't hear it and the music comes in. Just watching the title sequence where you've got this young couple talking to themselves, and you don't realize they're talking about he's going to kill her husband and then they're going to go away.
Yeah, right.
But the music just sort of stops and she keeps talking on the phone and you don't hear it. And he does that throughout. The Lovers, his next movie too. He really will play with, diegetic music that, it's right there, then it's gone. Same thing with Breaking Up Time. You have long takes, but then there's a big gap until your next scene. Andre Bazin used to talk about that in terms of like the new way in neo-realism, where he'd say, what's great about the stories is it's kind of like they put these scenes together, but there's gaps. It's like how you hop across a stream by jumping from rock to rock to rock. That's how their stories are put together, that there's these gaps in between. And that's really one thing that the new wave movies learn, I think, is to have a loose episodic kind of story structure. But you can also, spend a whole lot of time just watching somebody have a conversation without having reverse shots and have the usual editing rhythm.
And I mean, Louis Malle, I'm glad you mentioned him, because I mean, just as far as like the filmmaker himself and talking about like their styles and what they're bringing to their different films. I mean, we can see, even if you jump into the 80s with like Atlantic City or My Dinner with Andre, you're still seeing a lot of that same sensibility in storytelling and the way that he is choosing to kind of come at the stories that he's telling.
No, that's really true. He's got a long, fascinating career. And yes, he's always going to feel like, he was innovative and he wants to continue to be innovative, I think, throughout his career. He's always going to have, another auteur trait. He likes strong women characters, in a lot of his movies as well. But yeah, I think he's a fascinating figure who gets overlooked too much.
Yeah, and I mean, especially just like talking about those names that we're addressing, going back to that point, like he isn't one of the names that you regularly think of as the French New Wave. So it's interesting, like looking at this as kind of the first in our series of films, because it was the earliest that we were going to be talking about. But it's like, this is French New Wave, and it's already happening before we even get to François Truffaut's first film.
Right.
Speaking of, let's shift over to Truffaut and the 400 Blows. This is a fascinating film, probably the one I've seen the most of all of the films that we're talking about here today. It's his debut film. We've already mentioned that a number of these are first films for these people. This film follows the story of Antoine Doinel, a misunderstood adolescent in Paris, played by Jean-Pierre Melville. Antoine struggles with a difficult home life, including an indifferent mother and a stern stepfather, and frequently ends up getting into trouble at school. As he faces increasing challenges and feels more alienated from the world around him, he ends up turning to petty crime and truancy, which builds to the fantastic finale that we have when he ends up off to a boarding school and then running from it, and just that perfect way for the film to end. All right, we've got this very raw, very honest portrayal of youth here. We're definitely seeing kind of like the pain, the loneliness, the rebellion, also just the desire to have fun in our protagonist as he's kind of navigating this world that he's in. I hear that there's kind of an autobiographic element for Truffaut in this. What is he bringing to this? I mean, he did a short film before this. This is his first feature, and this is the story that he wants to tell. So what is he really bringing here?
Yeah, well, apparently the film does have many elements that correspond to Truffaut's biography. He was a troubled kid, like Antoine Doinel. He had a complicated family situation. He didn't feel loved. He ran away. He went AWOL from the military at a certain moment. Andre Bazin was a kind of father figure to him, even taking him in and letting him live with him and, helping him find his way through the world. Truffaut was a huge cinephile, a huge film buff. He started his own cine club very young, I think 16 years old, and he did this thing that's kind of, it runs parallel to what Antoine does in the movie 400 Blows. Antoine steals a typewriter, but what Truffaut did that got him into so much trouble was he decided to show a film by Jean Cocteau, I think it was Blood of a Poet, at his inaugural Cine Club screening. And he is going to be on Sunday afternoon. But he didn't bother to actually get his hands on a print, or he didn't go through the Cine Club Federation to get the print. He thought somehow that maybe Jean Cocteau would just loan him his personal print. I don't know why he thought that. None of that happened. Then people showed up and there was no Cocteau film and they were really mad. Also, then he would do other stupid things, and he ran up his bills. He really spent money he didn't have to rent films and to run this club. And eventually he had to shut it down because he had made all kinds of financial errors. And so he did that as a teenager, but he eventually found his way, obviously. The film was shot on location in the 9th district of Paris, which around Place de Clichy. And that was, I think he grew up in that neighborhood in large part. And so that was his stomping ground. He
did have he was never quite sure who his biological father really was. That comes out in the movie where he hears them arguing about him, etc. He did have a troubled relationship where he was raised for a number of years by his grandmother, and then may or may not have stolen from her too, just like Antoine talks about doing in the movie. So there were family things, but it's also a lot of the things in it were anecdotes from his family or his cousins. But also he had a best buddy growing up. And so René, the little boy who's got the eccentric older parents, apparently had older parents, who were less attentive to him. So his buddy also helped with writing script and putting in anecdotes. So a lot of it was very personal, but it's also, as Kelley mentioned, he was a film buff, and he put put in shots, I think, that are, quotes from certain neo-realist films early on when the school teachers are just sort of hanging out and the kids are playing at the school. You get these kind of shots that look like they could come out of a De Sica or Rossellini movie from the 40s. So he's putting personal stuff in. He's also doing what the Cahiers critics often do, which is say, gee, I wonder how Hitchcock would shoot this, or I wonder how Rossellini would shoot this, and then doing it. Renoir or Godard loved to do that later. So it is a personal tale. It's a very, it ended up getting, like, the Catholic Church gave it this big award because saying people should care about families and children more and stuff like that. So it was an earnest movie, even though it's funny. Again, it plays with genre. But it's also really an amazing performance from not only Jean-Pierre Léaud, who plays the boy, but really out of everybody. So he took some first-time filmmakers and some with a little career, but he's also trying to show how he starts his own film company. He creates his own actors. He's going to use Jean-Pierre Léaud becomes the face of the new wave in many ways for years to come. He's in many Truffaut films. So once again, just like Louis Malle getting Jeanne Moreau into a movie and then putting her in to star his next movie, Chabrol's going to do that with people. It's also building a whole new generation of actors that are going to be part of your own kind of mythical filmmaking career.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see the actor who plays his teacher pop up a few times in some of these films too. So there's another one of those actors who ends up. And I didn't even mention when we were talking about Elevator to the Gallows, but it's Jean-Claude Brialy who pops up in that one, and he ends up
Brialy's everywhere
all the way through. Yeah, he's quite popular here. This is a great example of shooting on location and just kind of like that sense of realism that we get here. I've never had as much a sense of a tiny Parisian apartment as when I watch this film and I see his room is like right by the front door and you got to like step over him in his bed even to get inside when he's in bed. It's like, it's so great to see, but you really feel like it just feels like you're there, and it's kind of astonishing because you see that, but like you're watching Hollywood films even of this period, and they're all sets and the houses and everything. They're so spacious. Everything is so spacious. Even if it's like a house of somebody who doesn't have a lot of money, it still is more spacious than it ever would be because it's easier for the cameras to move around. But here you're really getting in there and you're in these little spaces and these amazing places.
It's a good point. And one of the things is that, just look at how Paris is so different depending whether it's a Chabrol or a Romer or a Truffaut film, etc. But also you mentioned the camera. I mean, they're shooting whenever possible with lightweight, handheld 35 millimeter. This is André Decay again, who just did Elevator to the Gallows and other movies with Melville. Somebody who knows how to shoot light and quick without a lot of rehearsals, without 3-point lighting, setups, etc. And they're also starting to shoot with cameras that are really made for news gathering. So this is an era also after 59. Another reason is that they have new little Nagra tape decks that you can now have a 1/4-inch tape instead of big optical tracks on 35 millimeter recording. You can actually do sync sound recording with battery packs. And you've got like one person has this tape deck around their shoulder and a microphone, and they're synced up to a 35 millimeter lightweight camera and sometimes 16 millimeter. And you've got a camera crew that's 2 people now. So you can get into small cramped spaces without having fake walls and stuff like a Hitchcock might do in Rope. So yeah, it's a new technology these people are going to use. They're shooting in real apartments rather than renting studios whenever possible. And that's really important. And also Truffaut in this movie and others, when he decides, well, I got to shoot on a street, and you got a shot of like Antoine and his buddy maybe walking in a long distance along the street someplace. Well, you don't just pick a street but randomly you pick a street where you know somebody who lives there, so you can go up into their apartment, put the tripod in their window and watch them from a distance. So it's not only their spaces they're using that they're going to act in, you're also using friends' spaces and stuff to use to put your camera to have have people walk by. So it's a new different kind of filmmaking of just problem solving, how to do things on little money. And how many of these movies, this one, Elevator to the Gallows, people are walking down the street and people turn and look at the kids or look at the Jeanne Moreau, like, what's going on here? They're like, they don't quite get there's a movie being shot. They're not closing down streets and hiring extras. They're just going out on the street and shooting. And I think that gives it this liveliness. He's got, again, this bump soundtrack that Greta Gerwig's going to bring back in Frances Ha and stuff. He's got this great soundtrack that's going to be loose, like the meandering of the boys during the day. A lot of things in this movie remind us of some things in Louis Malle, I think, Elevator to the Gallows.
And another element with that is how they shoot Paris. And I think that's kind of interesting here because we do have shots in this film of like the opening credits. We're doing a lot of drive-bys and we see, oh, there's the Eiffel Tower in the background. And they kind of have these iconic parts of Paris in the films, but it's never shot in kind of the tourist's eye that you'd get like in an American film coming over and filming in Paris, where those are like so iconic that it has to always be in the background or something like that. And I mean, I'm sure as somebody living in Paris, they're probably used to it anyway. So it's less interesting for them to keep showing these things. But I do think it's interesting that they allow them to be there, but kind of from the streets as like a real person might see it like, oh, it's kind of in the background several blocks back. It's way back behind those buildings.
Right. And I don't think Truffaut returns to an iconic shot like that after the opening, right? I think it's just in the opening credits where we see that Eiffel Tower. And then after that, he's in decidedly untouristic neighborhoods like Pigalle and Place de Clichy and, the Ninth. I think it's a very fresh look at Paris for sure.
Yeah. This film is also speaking to kind of societal institutions, the way that you view schools, the education system. I feel like that's kind of a thread that we see throughout. Was that a big part of what these French New Wave filmmakers were looking at?
I'm not so sure. I know that, of course, in 400 Blows, school is a space of repression. Prison, this place where he has to go in the country is a space of repression. And, the ending of the film suggests that he's broken free from that for the moment, but who knows what's next? The military, we can imagine. But yeah, I'm not sure if that is a trend that I would identify as being part of the new wave, a kind of systematic critique of institutions. I think the films are so loose and the stories they're telling are so quirky that I would hesitate to assert that. I mean, we could talk about Godard's Le Petit Soldat, the little soldier, definitely criticizing the Algerian War and all that has wrought in a very subtle way, or even Umbrellas of Cherbourg sending off one of its protagonists to the Algerian War and thereby kind of undermining the central romance of the film. But I'm not sure I would say there's something systematic going on.
Well, it's definitely an interesting element here in this one because you get this sense of, I guess in this particular film, it definitely just feels like part of this, the reality for this kid. It may not be a French New Wave thing, but definitely like the education system just seems like it's not understanding him. His parents aren't helping out at all and everyone's frustrated by him. And so he's lost at sea and has to figure his life out for himself. And it's a very interesting element of this story as we watch this boy figure out how to grow up.
Yeah, and you're right. And much of the new wave kind of at least questions bourgeois norms of what is a family, etc. But they're not overtly always as political, maybe, as some people wanted them to be. But yeah, they do kind of, I think, acknowledge, and especially for Antoine, he can't go, he makes fun of the priest. Teachers aren't there for him. There's nobody, he has no safety net. His parents have their own problems. So yeah, I think it's not showing that there's some easy solution to social problems.
I would say, Andy, I think your point about institutions is making me think a little bit more deeply. It's a good one. The one institution that a lot of new wave films question is, of course, the institution of marriage and the traditional romantic couple, right? For 400 Blows, you see that's a broken marriage. It's not really working very well. And also they lie to each other. They lie to him. They're on different tracks, that husband and wife. But also I'm thinking back to La Pointe Courte, Varda's first film, which pits a deteriorating marriage of a Parisian couple against the lives of fishermen, and they have their own problems. The Lovers by Louis Malle and Elevator to the Gallows, there too, we've got, these rebellious women who are leaving their marriages for something else, or killing their husbands even, or having their, participating in the killing of her husband. And then later, I'm thinking about a film that Richard has written about extensively, Le Bonheur, Happiness by Varda, which is a subtle and scathing critique of the monogamous traditional marriage. So yeah, that runs through a lot of these films. What does it mean to be in a couple? What is marriage? I think about Vivre sa vie, and also A Woman is a Woman. A Married Woman by Godard makes a film called A Married Woman, Une Femme Mariée. So yeah, that is definitely a thread running through these films.
Interesting. Okay. Well, we'll be sure to talk about that as we kind of continue through this, because inevitably we'll hit it again at some point. Let's shift gears to our next film. Same year, 1959. This is Alain Resnais's Hiroshima, Mon Amour. This is a romantic drama written by Marguerite Duras and starring Emmanuelle Riva and Eiji Okada as a French actress and a Japanese architect who engage in a brief, intense affair in post-war Hiroshima. As they navigate their relationship, they grapple with the memories of their past traumas. She, as someone who faced humiliation for her love of a German soldier during World War II, and he, a soldier who experienced the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. Through a series of conversations and flashbacks, the film explores themes of memory, trauma, love, and the human condition in the aftermath of war. Very innovative narrative structure with this one, and I suppose that's a great place to start as far as what Resnais is doing here. Richard, do you want to talk about what kind of this style that Resnais is playing with?
Sure. And I'll also say I teach this often, and I've always been amazed at how many, especially women who want to go who are doing production classes, say it really affects their own script writing, that it really seems to impress a lot of people even today, but especially young women, kind of surprises me. Duras, who is a very famous new novelist of the era, and as well, and Resnais, well, he started initially, it was supposed to be a documentary. He had done Night and Fog, one of the most famous films about concentration camps. And the producers had some money stuck in Japan, and they needed to make some kind of movie about a French theme, but shot in Japan. But they wanted to do some kind of, initially, a documentary. And then he and Duras, he just said this, he just couldn't do it about Hiroshima. So let's do a love story with the Hiroshima bomb in the background. So it's really a new novel, and Resnais is brilliant as a filmmaker, but he also is one of the few of these new wave people who put so much of his trust in collaborating with a screenwriter, a novelist, because his next film is going to be last year at Marienbad with Alain Resnais, the other really famous writer of the era. So it's as much Duras' story in some ways as it is a Resnais film, and they really did collaborate to work out this real amazing drama as well. And he chose the actors mostly by their voices.
Oh, really?
Apparently. And the Japanese actors spoke almost no French, and he just had to memorize his lines phonetically, which also creates this kind of a strange noteness once in a while, I think, in the movie as well. So, but yeah, I think it's just a really puzzling narrative that doesn't follow a typical structure like a lot of these scripts. And it's a great, great representation of characters with very little psychological background in lots of ways. He doesn't even name them, right? I mean, they don't have names, I don't think, right? They're just him and her as well. So it's a real product of the French new novels, getting away from Balzac and psychological realism, getting away from, so more than some of the other filmmakers, I think this movie is not aware of and breaks far from any genre rules in lots of ways.
And that's one of the things that really caught my eye was the way that he played with those mental flashbacks that were just incredibly quick, that are throughout the film. That today's eyes, I mean, we see filmmakers doing that all the time, but reading about this, it's like this was kind of a very new technique that he was playing with here of like these incredibly quick cuts. And sometimes it's puzzle pieces for us as we start figuring out what they're thinking about. Like for her, it's like we see when she's looking at this architect in bed and he's sleeping and his hand is moving. There's a quick shot of somebody else's hand also kind of moving, and we're like, I don't know who that was, but she's thinking about something. And all these puzzle pieces, as we start figuring out, eventually we learn, okay, that was this German soldier that she had fallen in love with who ends up getting killed. And that was such a fascinating element of the story that really puts us into their heads as we're seeing these images that kind of just creates a mental space for them.
Yeah, and it's also the opposite of a classical Hollywood flashback. This is not Casablanca where he suddenly starts to now you're back in Paris. So yeah,
the dreamy dissolves.
Yeah, there are many times where you cut back and forth, like, is this France or is this a street in Japan by the end of the film as well? And even just the opening where you've got this really stunning opening of two bodies with some fallout or something on them, and some woman is saying, I went to the museum, and you see documentary shots of a museum, and he says, no, you didn't, but you never actually see, and she says, yes, I did. You never see her in a museum, but we see shots of a museum. Like, you don't know, what can you trust? Is this really her flashback? Is her thinking? And I don't know of another movie where the soundtrack and the visual track are so different. Because a lot of what she's doing is she might be talking to the Japanese guy about what happened to her, but we see images of her jumping over fences and meeting the lover and all these other things that he doesn't see. So, like, what can he make out of what she's telling sometimes? So it's about a traumatized woman who is somehow reliving parts of that trauma. But the amazing thing is we never get to know much about him. He's married and he seems to pick up a lot of women while she's out of town or something. But we know nothing about him. The whole movie is really about her trying to deal with some kind of trauma, but it never comes to a foreground. And we never know, is she worse off or better off at the end of the movie? So Antoine Doinel is just frozen on the beach. To a certain extent, she's kind of frozen in her hotel room. I'm not sure what she's going to do tomorrow either. And that's another trait of these new wave films. Robbe-Grillet, the new novelist, when he made movies, people say, well, what happens next? He says, well, nothing. It's a movie. It stopped. All you can do is put on the first reel again. And the same thing here. Duras and Resnais never wanted to say, does she go back to France? Does she stay? They said, we're not sure we even agree. So it's not this sort of realistic world that they're presenting to us.
Speaking of trauma, and Kelley, I'm curious about your thoughts with this, because there's, she talks about over the course of the film, we're getting this sense of her trauma that she's experienced from having fallen in love with this German soldier, him getting killed, her being kind of locked up because of this and all of this sort of stuff that had gone on. But also at the beginning of the film, especially, we're getting a lot of like kind of very intense images of everything that the aftermath in Hiroshima. And it's graphic and difficult to kind of take in, really. But I think it speaks a lot to just trauma in general. How does that end up affecting you as you watch this? And what are they saying about trauma?
I think Resnais is asking us to hold two different expressions of trauma in our heads at the same time. And it was risky, if you think about it. He was asked to make a documentary about the bomb. He said, no, people have done that. And who am I to make that documentary? But, I'll work with Marguerite Duras and we'll tell a different kind of a story. So he found a way to do that. But he's asking us to think about the atomic bomb and then one woman's loss of her German lover. So that was risky, right? And in fact, some of the critics at the time said, wait a minute, are you saying that her loss is the same as Japan's loss of hundreds of thousands of people? That's outrageous. But I don't think he's saying that these are the same order of tragedy, but he is asking us to think about the commonalities of the traumatic experience, whether on a national level or an individual level. And of course, he spends most of the film exploring her trauma. Although you're so right to point out, Andy, that those kind of quasi-documentary shots near the beginning of people in a hospital who have been injured by the bomb, those are really challenging. And they really do they insist that we think about the cost of that decision. So it's not as if he's ignoring that kind of trauma on a personal level in the Japanese setting. But after that, he spends most of his time on the woman's trauma, which is on a more personal level. And what I find interesting also is that, he uses, as you say, he uses flashbacks in many different ways, many unusual ways. But he puts her experiences back in World War II out of order. It's not like the flashback sections are in chronological order. We as viewers are asked to put together that story. And I would say this film, more than many New Wave films, has a distinct division between plot and story. And by that, I mean, the plot is the film before us, the film in the order that the director is telling us. And then the story is that other thing that we create in our heads through inferences, through assumptions, through the dialogue that we hear. We put together the whole big story in our mind by the time the film is over. Okay, so directors have different ways of treating that plot story distinction. But Resnais, in both Hiroshima and last year at Marienbad, really plays with a radical disjunction between those two things. So he asks a lot of the viewer. He assumes that we will work hard to understand what is in front of us. And to his credit, I think he pulls it off in a magnificent way. Even if we don't know anything about World War II in France or what happened to those women who had relationships with German men, we are asked to feel that. And we are there momentarily. And we are in Hiroshima and we see the effects of that bomb. And so I think, so it's both a moving look at historical trauma and personal trauma. And it's a film that rewards the active viewer.
And there's a sense of, in both characters, as this relationship continues over, 24 or 36 hours, something like that, of their journey to try to put some of that behind them. Like, not necessarily forget about it, but just kind of like move past it in some way. And it feels like by talking about it and like having these conversations and even just their entire relationship feels like there's this element of it that is both of them working on airing it so that they can move on. And I found that to be powerful.
Absolutely. It's very powerful. At some points, the Japanese man seems to be behaving as her therapist. He even, the personal pronouns shift at a certain moment when she's telling her story. And pretty soon he's like, you are in the room. And, and where am I? He kind of takes on the persona of the German soldier in a certain way. So yeah, it's a very talky film in a certain way. I mean, there's a lot of dialogue, but it's not handled conventionally. But there's a kind of this sense that, it's very literary dialogue, full of repetition, and it's just a gorgeous script. It's very
poetic.
Stylized, poetic, extremely poetic. But also there's this implicit sense that what is happening is similar to the talking cure or a therapeutic situation.
Yeah.
No, that's true. And it's also very self-conscious because, you've got an actress, she's playing an actress who's from France coming to make a movie about peace in this movie about the bomb. So yeah, it's also very self-conscious and in lots of ways. So it knows it's a movie at all times. It reminds us it's a movie at all times. And at the same time, we start to really care about her getting her head shaved or being thrown in the basement again. So I think it's a real good, for a spectator's position, it's a really fascinating movie. And it was really popular. This is what students don't believe. This was like Time Magazine said, this is the new wave's masterpiece. It sold more tickets in New York City than Breathless, 400 Blows, any of them. People went multiple times. And also a lot of people came because they were French professors and they'd heard about Duras and they're going to see it for that reason. But it was really, really popular. And so was Marienbad. These difficult movies that today nobody would try to make, much less sell globally, was huge. And it also, so it shows just how exciting the French New Wave was to have all these different kinds of movies following one after another on American screens at big cities.
Yeah, it's that new voice that it's just kind of a breath of fresh air. You're getting something new and exciting. I hadn't seen this film before, and I'd seen Night and Fog, which is a powerful gut punch of a film. And so I wasn't sure if I was going to be getting some of the same here. And certainly like when it starts, but then what was so fascinating is like once we get to that point where he goes to visit her on set and you're seeing like these reenactments of protests and all of this sort of stuff. And then, but it started making me think, was I looking at real documentary footage at the beginning, or were they recreating some of this? And I suppose this is also a new wave element of like blurring the lines. I mean, we definitely see that with someone like Varda, where they're really playing with these lines of documentary, fiction. How can we kind of combine these things in these stories?
Yeah, absolutely. Resnais got started by making art documentaries. There was a certain trend in the 40s. He's a bit older than some of the other filmmakers, of making documentaries about individual paintings or filming artists like Picasso at work I think Resnais made a film about Van Gogh and many others. He made 4 or 5 of these art documentaries. And then, of course, as you say, his 1955 Night in Fog was a monumental account of the Holocaust. But he made others. He worked with Chris Marker, another New Wave filmmaker. They made a documentary together about the French National Library and about African art. And, he was really a very, very skilled documentary filmmaker. So, yeah, you see that in the fiction films, too.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Let's shift gears and go to a very different type of film, Jean-Luc Godard's 1960 film Breathless. This is, again, his feature film debut. This film stars Jean-Paul Belmondo as Michel, a small-time criminal who models himself after Humphrey Bogart, and Jean Seberg as Patricia, an American student working in Paris as a journalist. After stealing a car and then impulsively killing a police officer, Michel hides out in Patricia's apartment, trying to convince her to run away with him to Italy. This film follows their interactions and the tension that builds as the police close in on him. This film is very famous for its jump cuts, the handheld camera work, the acting that feels very spontaneous, very naturalistic. Again, not necessarily having the hair and makeup department come in and do stuff, and very much breaking away from a lot of the traditional filmmaking techniques. It's definitely capturing so much in so many ways, the kind of the youthful spirit of the French New Wave, I think, here. But my understanding is like some of the stuff, like the jump cuts, were because like the film was too long and he had to figure out a way to cut it down and shorten it. So just cut parts of a long take out to make it shorter, which also speaks to kind of just like the rebellious way of the movement. What is Jean-Luc Godard like? How does his entry into, we'll just say, the French New Wave really kind of mark it and kind of start reshaping things moving forward?
So what's so cool about Godard? Well, first of all, it's an audacious, energetic film that students still love to this day. And yes, his jump cuts were important, but by now it's become such a normal trend. I mean, you see jump cuts in perfume commercials. There's nothing radical about it these days, but it was definitely radical back then. And one of the things I love so much about this film is it shows so clearly the love that Godard had for Hollywood B movies. So he dedicates this film to Monogram Pictures, which was a Hollywood studio that made low budget pictures, including Gun Crazy, fabulous film, noir, right? And so you may remember from Gun Crazy, there's a moment in which there's a camera in the backseat of the car. We're watching the getaway car, and we're in the car with them, and they've robbed a bank again. It's kind of a Bonnie and Clyde style setup where these two young lovers are committing crimes and then they're on the run. Well, in fact, Bonnie and Clyde was, of course, influenced by Gun Crazy. But anyway, at a certain moment, the female criminal is looking back over her shoulder, over the back seat, and the camera is there and ready to capture her excitement, the excitement of crime. And it's just thrilling. And so Godard, in Breathless, sits in the back seat or asks his cinematographer, Raoul Coutard, to sit in the back seat of that car and film Jean Seberg's face as the two of them are riding around Paris. But he doesn't just copy Gun Crazy. He adds his own twist to it, which is to violate an editing convention in continuity editing, or Hollywood's conventional style of moving the camera at least 30 degrees when you move from one shot to the next, so as to avoid the jump on the screen. So he used jump cuts in that scene and many others, and it really adds a kind of vitality and freshness and kinetic energy to the film.
Yeah, and if I can just give a good example, and it's one that, again, student filmmakers either really love it or really say, this is terrible, he's ruining he's wrecking everything. But so, yeah, at one point, the Belmondo character is driving with Seberg and mentions, he says a bunch of traits about her, and you get all these cuts of her from, that he's just taken out visually, tuk, 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 but the soundtrack is continuous. So this notion of like, it raises a kind of question that Louis Malle did early on, like where is the sound versus the image? So this notion that you can have, if the image track is broken up and pieces are missing, but the soundtrack is consistent and he's supposed to be him talking. It just throws everything into question. And it's a really marvelous use. It's not just a random use. That's why I've never been quite convinced of that whole idea of, well, he just had to cut things out. So he made jump cuts. But
it's a funny story,
though. He did it in a very clever, no, everybody says so, and he's claimed so, but it must have led to a completely different production process. So yeah, this is a movie that Time Magazine, again, the American press is fascinated with this stuff and said it's a cubistic thriller. So they're trying to make it into this sort of art thing as well. But yeah, it's a movie that is going to be very aware, as Kelley says, of other genre stuff, but it's also going to play with constantly calling attention to the fact that I know I'm a movie. So Belmondo's going to talk to the his character's going to talk to the camera, etc. You're going to go in and out of translation at certain points. Soundtrack will disappear. You get a tribute to Bogart. So it's about movies. And it's quoting movies, and it's also about being a movie in lots of ways. And I think there's a really good, the first big new wave book in English by Monaco. He said, look, The 400 Blows was fresh and new. Breathless was revolutionary. So for a lot of people, this movie just consistently, the storytelling, the style, Kelley already mentioned earlier that, long takes of them just having conversations in bed. And how is this advancing the narrative? And again, it's a very different kind of Paris than we've seen in the other movies as well. But no, I think on every level it becomes a primer. And Godard is one who famously said, because France is one of the best films, one of the most famous film schools in the world. EDEC it was back then. And he said, the best thing that ever happened to me was not getting accepted into the film school, EDEC, because then I would have learned where to put my camera. I would have learned to light like everybody else. I would have learned where to put a microphone like everybody else. So that notion of I didn't get into the school, so I'm going to not follow rules was part of a personal publicity stunt maybe. But at the same time, there's a sort of pride with a lot of the new wave people of we're going to find our own solutions informed by other movies we've seen, informed by our own personalities, and informed often by the spontaneity of the actors as well. So yeah, Godard was a tough director during this as well. It's famous Seberg and Belmondo both were ready to quit. Belmondo said, he's making a movie like it's 1915. We shoot everything silent. He says, don't worry, you'll fill dialogue in later. But he also did things like, there's the beautiful scenes of them walking down the street where he put the camera operator inside of a mail cart with a little hole cut to follow them up the Champs-Élysées while everybody else is doing their other stuff. The cinematographer's pushing a camera operator up the street and Godard's walking next to him. Near the end, there's this great scene with circular logic where Patricia's trying to explain to him why she's turning him into the police, etc. And they kind of go around the room. Well, he shot it in a wheelchair. So suddenly things like wheelchairs every film school in America got a wheelchair. That was unprofessional. You had to have tracks. So it really also taught people that you could use different equipment, shoot in different places. They go in an elevator at one point where he's going to follow a guy up in the elevator. I mean, it's one of those tiny French elevators. Well, you got a camera operator with a camera on his shoulder up against the wall so he can show these two other guys go up and down the elevator. It just reminds you constantly, that they're shooting in an unconventional fashion with no conventional lighting, without conventional microphones. So it's all a real marvelous experiment, and it's just a rousing kind of fun film.
And I suppose in the scope of guerrilla filmmaking that you were mentioning, I'm assuming based on the way that they were shooting some of these things, like putting having the camera inside a mail cart and stuff, that they also weren't necessarily getting permits. I mean, we've kind of talked about not using any extras, but just actual passersby. So yeah, it just seems like they're probably just running, gunning, let's just get this shot real quick.
Absolutely.
That's really true. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I can say Truffaut had a very famous article in the 1950s before he made his first movie saying, get out of this, telling other filmmakers, get out of the studios, go out in the streets, you should use sunlight. It's free. You don't have to have lighting. And so when he got a chance, and Godard and all their buddies, they really had already this sort of aesthetic of liberate yourself, liberate your actors, liberate the camera, liberate your editing. You don't have to follow all the usual rules. And the fact that they made money. I mean, Truffaut, they sold his North American rights alone for $100,000 the first day at Cannes. Cost him $50,000 to make the movie. So he's doubled his money before ever shown in a movie theater. Same thing with Hiroshima Mon Amour gets the top prize for Critics Award. Breathless is going to be this huge hit. So you've got these new movies made really risky fashion that are also proving incredibly profitable, which leads to a bunch of other people saying, well, I can make a $50,000 movie. Do you want to make one? So that's, again, part of that wave thing. These guys keep making new movies themselves, but inspiring a whole bunch of other people to try their shot at it.
It's amazing the way that it keeps evolving and changing. Let's jump into the last film we're going to be talking about. It's Cleo from 5 to 7. This is Agnès Varda's film from 1962. It follows Cleo in real time. She's a Parisian singer, and it's essentially 5 to 6:30. It's not really 5 to 7, but she's waiting for this results on this medical test to determine whether or not she has cancer. The story unfolds over this 90 minutes, during which she confronts her mortality. She meets various people. She wanders through the streets of Paris, and she's grappling with her fears and the possibility of her life being cut short. And so it's a very transformative journey as she's kind of reflecting on her life, all of the decisions that she's made, shopping for hats, all of these wonderful things. And it's really reflecting. And it's all through this feminist eye and a number of different chapters over the course of the film. Fascinating way to kind of construct the film and explore. So let's talk about what Varda is doing here with this film and this shift that she's kind of made of telling us a personal story in real time of this woman waiting for this test.
One of the things I love about this film is that Varda uses this characteristic mix of documentary realism, Cleo walking through the streets, etc., Cleo in the hat shop while the Republican Guard's horses go by. And so Varda's able to capture that, take advantage of it. And that she didn't plan that. So this kind of looseness that we associate with documentary, kind of spontaneity and street life, the students running around the Latin Quarter, harassing her as she's in that taxi, that funny moment. All of that was spontaneous. And yet Varda is a planner and she knows what she wants. And she's got a very carefully constructed narrative with Cleo's trajectory through that part of Paris. It's all like written and planned, but also it has this sense of spontaneity. And also another striking thing about this film is that it shows you how Varda was able to take advantage of opportunities and still leave her mark on a film. So she initially wanted to make a film in color that would involve multiple locations in multiple countries, and it would have a lot of music. It would be very expensive, in other words. And so she went to the new wave producer, Georges de Beauregard, and said, here's my vision. I think it was Godard who introduced her to de Beauregard. Back to your idea, Andy, of people helping each other out. And so he said, okay, I'll let you make a film. Here's some money, but it can't be in color. It has to be in black and white, and it can't be shot in all these countries. It has to be, in Paris. These are my constraints, and here's the budget, which was small. And she figured it out. That's what gave her the idea to create a story that takes place in one day, or an hour and a half, actually, as you say. So she worked with constraints that she was facing to create this really inventive tale of a woman confronting her fears, but also walking through a fascinating Paris. So that to me is the strength of the film, the looseness, the documentary, plus the fiction conventions, and then just this extraordinary view of Paris. I love, whenever I miss Paris, I just watch Cleo because you really feel like you're there walking down the Rue de Rivoli near the beginning, when she's going to that cafe and we get that high angle shot of Cleo walking and being talked to by extras who, non-actors in the film. It's just, she really captures the energy of Paris.
And I like that she was able to sneak some color in at the beginning of the film with the tarot reading, which is fun.
Yeah, that's true.
Richard, I was just going to ask you for your thoughts on this one and its place in the French New Wave.
Yeah, and I also just want to acknowledge, Kelley Conway is one of the great Varda specialists and was a very, very close friend of hers as well. And she even launched the first international conference for Varda back in 2002 or something.
Wow. Okay.
But no, I where it fits is really fascinating. As Kelley mentioned, it was Jacques Tati and Godard were good friends. Demi was her lover and then husband at this point. Godard was a good friend of hers, and Anna Karina. So they're all hanging out and again, talking to distributors and producers and trying to get things made. This film also, for her first one, La Pointe Courte, Alain Resnais was her editor. And I think she taught him a lot and he taught her a lot. But the editing here is also just amazing, where you also have inserts. So just like Hiroshima Mon Amour, where you suddenly get shots of like a museum or something. I mean, there are moments here where she's going to walk down the sidewalk and there's this incredible montage. Some are shots we've already seen in the movie. Some are never in the movie. Is this her mind wandering? What's going on? So the editing is also just, kind of mind-boggling sometimes, where she breaks up that real time and space that is carefully told. Here's the next 7 minutes of the movie. It tells you how many minutes that next scene is going to be for each chapter. And yet she breaks up this sort of mental subjective stuff too, that we're not sure whose vision is this. So the editing, I think, is one of those things that also, you got beautiful, beautiful long takes, etc. near the end when the camera pulls back and stuff. But you're also going to have her use an actress who was in Jacques Demi's movie. So she's also like the New Wave people, creating new actors, but also some of them aren't going to be professional actors the rest of their lives. So it fits a lot of things about the New Wave, but especially that cheapness and the fact that many of them want to shoot in color. Color is contemporary. Color is cool. These are contemporary filmmakers with the language of their era. They have spontaneous dialogue and slang and all this stuff, but they have to kind of shoot in black and white, which is the language of the past. So it was frustrating for many of them, Jacques Demy especially, but even Varda. But she managed to do a great job of making this really beautiful female-centered movie, which is also really important for this era.
I'm glad you mentioned kind of the subjectivity, because as we go through the chapters, that changes. And it particularly affected me when we got to that last chapter and it was the two of them. I'm like, oh, that's just really nice. Like the way that they build to that, because I wasn't expecting that to kind of turn into just kind of like this connection between the two of them, the way that he kind of thrust himself upon her. It was just like, somebody who just, one of those people who's very talkative and just wants to chat with you. And you're just like, I'm not in the space for that right now, but it worked, and it built to that wonderful end of the two of them going to the hospital and everything. And it's just really beautiful story that really gave us this sense of this woman who's very complex. And I think, like a lot of these films, I suppose there's this sense of kind of an existential exploration of what is life that we're kind of getting. And I think, I don't know, it's just a really touching, powerful film.
It is, and it's also, again, very personal. Antoine, the guy the soldier who's about to go off to Algeria, was a former lover of hers and the father of her daughter. So they're like close. It's also got that suspended ending, a bit like Antoine at the beach. We're not quite sure, like, what's going to happen with her. Is she going to survive this cancer, and how long will it be, etc. But it also has, this movie has one of those great, great scenes, just like the rotor in 400 Blows, where she breaks into song and then rebels in the middle of the movie. And when she sings this sad, sad song, Cri d'amour, in the middle, and suddenly a orchestra comes up, and so it plays with this artifice. It acknowledges it. That's one of the great things about the French New Wave. It has a bunch of shifts in mood, but it also keeps acknowledging we're just a movie. And Kelley knows this very well. She was very angry at the end when she looked at the last rushes of that beautiful last shot of the doctor supposedly pulling away, and you could see a track in the background over the shoulder. And later on, she reshot it, but it just didn't feel as good, so she left the track in there. And the same thing happens in Umbrella Cherbourg early on. You can see a camera track on the ground, but they just figure, heck, we know we're a movie. We'll just leave it in there.
Right. So she's getting back to the idea of the kind of cross-fertilization that was happening between these directors. So Varda was married to Jacques Demy, but their film styles were really different. But they both, of course, loved music. And Varda wrote most of the lyrics to the songs that you hear in Cleo and many of her other films. But also, remember in Cleo, when the composer and lyricist come over to help Cleo, who is a popular singer, they're over to rehearse with her. The pianist was Michel Legrand, who collaborated with Jacques Demy, Varda's then husband, on so many fabulous musicals. So there's a real connection there. And Varda wrote the lyrics to a song that appears in Lola, Jacques Demy's wonderful film with Anouk Aimée, which takes place in part in a kind of cabaret. Varda wrote the song that Aimée sings, "Call Me," "C'est moi, c'est Lola." She wrote that. So it was a rare moment of Varda contributing to Demi's work because their visions were very different about what film could be. Varda's work was much more rooted in documentary realism and a certain kind of experimentation. Jacques Demy was more interested in fantasy, fairy tale conceptions of life and the Hollywood musical. But I love how in Cleo their two paths cross in a certain way.
Yeah. No, that's really, it's awesome how that happens, because it's a great little scene when they're standing around the piano and they're all together.
Right.
It plays really well. So kind of starting to kind of shift into our the last part of our conversation about like the influence it had. We recently lost Varda. In fact, we've kind of hit in the last few years a point where we've lost all of these French New Wave filmmakers. But I think that, as you said, Richard, earlier on, like these filmmakers kept making films and were making films all the way up through all of these decades and influencing people all through. So, I mean, the French New Wave itself went on to influence many different things. From my understanding, it played a part in the birth of the Japanese New Wave and the Czech New Wave, which were two of these different New Wave movements that we ended up having. But I think that there's a lot of other elements that you can see. I mean, even I had a conversation a few episodes ago about mumblecore, and this whole conversation feels like mumblecore all over again. It's just like these filmmakers who just wanted to do something new and just like tell these stories. And it's amazing to see. So, I mean, talk about like just the influences that it had at the time, and then just kind of like those waves of influence that it's had over all these decades.
I would say that one of the initial influences was in American independent cinema. So the Cassavetes of the world, people like that, to look around. One of the great ones is also, Roman Polanski famously said, well, if they can make a movie for $50,000 in Paris, think what I can do in Warsaw. So it influenced a whole bunch of people around who just suddenly they looked around and said, where I live could be cinematic too. You didn't have to have someplace that looks like a magnificent postcard. You tell stories about where you live. And I think that honesty, looser scripts influenced just about all kinds of modern filmmaking and contemporary filmmaking. And this is also the era when Hollywood's falling apart. Hollywood, the big studio system is broken down. And by 60s, people are really grappling with where's the audience and what are they going to do? And you wouldn't have had The Graduate. I mean, the whole notion that, even in The Graduate, and much less Bonnie and Clyde, I mean, they even wanted Truffaut to direct it. So American films wanted this French influence. American magazines are full of stories about these actors and directors, etc. So it's not just that they're going to influence the sort of third world filmmakers or Eastern European filmmakers. There's really going to be this sense that they were doing something important and others should do it as well.
Yeah, I would say that we should also note that Varda, for example, all of these filmmakers, as Richard said, influenced other people who were inspired by a low budget mode of filmmaking. All of a sudden, what used to feel like a very closed industry and an impossible dream became imaginable for generations of people. And that's a wonderful thing. But I can also say that Varda, for example, explicitly influenced a lot of female filmmakers who can, historically have been a little bit more shut out of the film industry. So I think in France alone, you can see influences on the work of Claire Denis, Céline Sciamma, Laetitia Masson, and in the U.S., independent filmmakers like Kelly Reichardt. Even Madonna loves Varda and thought about remaking Cleo, and and she would star as Cleo, but it never happened. So there's that idea too, that if you have stories to tell, and you're clever and resourceful, you can find a way to do that. And that was particularly inspiring to women, I would say.
Yeah.
Well, the independent film movement, as you mentioned, I mean, I think there's a lot of that. I mean, you look at, as you said, other low budget things. Dogma 95 is another one you could say, they're wanting to break the system and do something new. But also, I think there's like looking at the new Hollywood filmmakers who came in after this, even Steven Spielberg, definitely not a low budget filmmaker. Brian De Palma, Francis Ford Coppola, Martin Scorsese, all of these filmmakers in the late 60s, early 70s who saw what they were doing. And you can see kind of like that period of the 70s in Hollywood really as a reflection of what the French New Wave had been, how they had influenced that.
That's really, really true. And, and more recently too, not only, Tarantino naming his company after a Godard movie and stuff like that.
Sure.
Students think it's cool. But Sean Baker, to shoot a movie with an iPhone, for Tangerine on the streets, with non-professional performers, is just the ultimate kind of, tribute to the French New Wave, I think.
Yeah, and talk about like that Godard energy in that film, right? It's like
That's
full
true.
of that. It's
That's
just like
true. Sound versus image, bang bang, clash, and
right.
Yes. So no, I think it's it's one of those things. It's like montage from the Soviets. You can say it's everywhere, and the New Wave spirit, I think, is also everywhere. And from beer commercials to Tarantino movies, you can see the influence. That's true.
Yeah, I think as time goes on, most movements only last about 7 years. Italian neorealism, 45 to 52, Soviet montage, maybe we can argue about when that ends too. But then also the New Wave, roughly 58 to 62 or 3 or 4. But always there's, depending upon the shifts in technology, shifts in funding availability, there are these periodic bouts of energy around filmmaking that I think about the development of digital technology as another moment, one that affected Varda in 2000 when she picked up a digital video camera after kind of having retired. She starts making digital documentaries that are stunning and that completely reinsert her into the world landscape of filmmaking. So I think the New Wave is not unique. It is uniquely fabulous, I would say, in terms of the films it produced, but it's the way that these filmmakers drew on new technologies, new methods of financing, and certain other kind of socio-cultural things in the air of the time, the desire for reaffirming a new idea of national identity, for example. I think all those things can come together in different periods, and they do.
Yeah.
Thankfully.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
And can I just say one other influence within France is that the CNC has always, ever since, realized how important this was. They give funding. They give a special program every year to first-time filmmakers. They want 25% of their money to go to first-time filmmakers still to this day. And that's why it's a lot easier for anybody to make a first feature film in France than anywhere else in the world right now. Might be hard to get your second one, but you get special. So, and the film school wants 50% women directing, etc. So there's this real sense of what was the New Wave and how it should influence stuff. And the system itself wants youth and new influences in their industry, and they're very aware of it. That comes from the New Wave.
Yeah. This is just kind of a side question, but because so many of these filmmakers started in like the Cahiers du Cinema, would you say that there was an influence in film criticism and writing about film as well?
Oh, definitely. Actually, French film journals had been thriving for going back to the 20s. The French kind of invented a certain idea of film criticism, I have to say. And going back to 1915 with Louis Deluc and Germain Dulac and Epstein and other people creating film-specific publications and writing really astute criticism. It goes way back. But certainly the French New Wave revitalized the notion that criticism was important and a space of experimentation in and of itself. But I think between 45 and 60, there were something like 185. No, I know this because I just have co-edited a collection of essays on the history of film magazines. I think in 58, there was something like 190 film magazines in France.
Wow.
Film publications. It's insane, right? So this has to do with the vibrancy of film culture of the time. But yeah, I think I don't think that was completely unique to the era, but it was somewhat distinctive, I would say.
Yeah.
And the attention to detail, the attention to mise en scène, where, I think the French criticism was not just about the story, not just about the stars and the history of the director. It was really about, mise en scène choices, directing choices, as well as auteurism in a way. And I think every filmmaker has been very aware of how they're going to be looked at as an auteur. Do they have their own camera movements? Do they have their own use of depth? What is their editing aesthetic? So I think it did, just like film students, I think it really made filmmakers think differently. And so it helped educate audiences, as Kelley said, but it also, I think, helped educate filmmakers.
Right. Also, I think something that might be unique to that period is that you can see this in the magazines like the one Richard mentioned, Cinema, which was linked to a Cine Club Federation. You can see people believing that all kinds of films are worthy of our attention. Popular genre films, Hollywood films, Japanese films, and films from all Indian films, short films, feature-length films, fiction, documentary. There, you see in the journals, attention is being paid to all kinds of filmmaking. I think in 1957, there was an issue of Cinema that featured Jean Gabin on the cover, the famous actor,
right,
who was so important in poetic realism, and through the 50s, major star. So he's on the cover, and the magazine issue publishes excerpts from his memoir, and also a really astute essay about this documentary film co-directed by Resnais and Chris Marker on, it's called Les Statues Meurent aussi, Statues Also Die. Is that what we call that in English? Yeah. This film that was criticizing the art market in Africa and also celebrating the aesthetic qualities of statues themselves. So like, this is a magazine that can hold, in one hand, the star approach, kind of a fanish kind of approach to the cinema, and really astute film criticism about a challenging film. And there were also articles in that journal about the need to improve the film education of technicians in the French film industry. There was a call for, new energy to be put into EDEC, that film school. So like really practical calls for change. So, all these kinds of discourses were floating around in one magazine. So it wasn't just Cahiers, it wasn't just Positif. It was a whole ecosystem of attention to film in all its forms and in all its glories. It was a magnificent moment, I have to say.
Wow. And just to have so many people excited and passionate about film, that's what's really cool. So,
yeah.
Well, both of you, this has been a fantastic conversation about French New Wave. A lot of really interesting information. Thank you both so much for being here. I definitely appreciate it. Before we go, I want you both to have the opportunity, if you have books or any place on the web that you want to direct people, do you have anything you want to plug?
For New Wave books, Michel Marie, one of my former professors, and Kelley knows him, has a book that was in French I published 20 years ago, I think now. It has the French New Wave and Artistic School by Michel Marie, and I have a book called, The History of the French New Wave Cinema. Those are good places to start for general New Wave things.
Fantastic.
I should say, if you want to know what happened before the New Wave, Richard has another wonderful book that just came out recently called French Film History, 1895 to 1946. And it's a book that it's based on, really in-depth research of the industry, aesthetics, reception. It kind of like looks at all kinds of films with a fresh eye. And it's kind of like going to be the new textbook in classrooms that pay attention to French film. I just put it on my syllabus, Richard. But also, let's see, if I want to plug anything, I wrote a book about Agnès Varda in a series published by the University of Illinois Press, based on living filmmakers. She was then still alive. Alas, she's no longer with us, but that's called simply Agnès Varda. And it's a study of her key works and specifically her working methods, her mode of production. How did these films come to be? How did they emerge? So you can check that out. But you know what? We're really in a moment of a flourishing of scholarship on Varda. People will never stop writing about Godard and Truffaut. But I think Varda has come into her own now, and she's the object of many, many monographs, collections of essays, exhibitions. She's everywhere. She was at LACMA, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, massive exhibition on her work, at the same time as the Cinémathèque Française had an exhibition on her life and her career. So she's gone, but she definitely lives on, as do many new wave filmmakers. I mean, believe me, there's more to say about all of these filmmakers and their extraordinary work.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Speaking of, remember everybody, if you want to hear us continue our conversation, talk about a few more films in the member bonus segment, you can go to truestory.fm/join and learn more about that. Next month, we will delve into the twisted Technicolor world of Italian giallo films. We will be unraveling the tangled web of mystery, madness, and murder that defines this stylish and suspenseful horror subgenre. From the lush cinematography to the pulse-pounding scores, we will explore how giallo's audacious aesthetics and psychological thrills redefined the horror landscape. Prepare to be captivated by the genre's iconic masked killers, labyrinthine plots, and the seductive allure of its glamorous yet deadly heroines. Join us as we embark on a chilling journey through the blood-soaked streets and shadowy psyches of this unforgettable cinematic style. But be warned, once you enter the world of giallo, you may never see horror the same way again. Thanks for joining us on CinemaScope, part of the True Story FM Entertainment Podcast Network. Music by Orcus and Kyle Preston. Find us and the entire The Next Reel family of film podcasts at truestory.fm. Follow us on social media at The Next Reel, and please rate and review us if your podcast app allows. As we part ways, remember, your cinematic journey never ends. Stay curious. Hey, Pete, have you ever been fascinated by the allure of secret societies throughout history?
Are you kidding me right now, Andy? I live for this stuff. From the Freemasons to the Illuminati, I am obsessed with these clandestine groups. The Rosicrucians and their ancient wisdom, the Skull and Bones Society at Yale with its powerful alumni network. I'm drawn to them. There's something about how they offer this exclusive access to hidden knowledge. They totally capture my imagination. It's like they give this sense of belonging to something greater than oneself.
Wow, sounds like you're looking for one yourself.
Do you even need to ask? Where do I sign? How much blood do I have to give? Are there any required tattoos or brands involved? Is it my first or second born that they need?
Well, what if I told you that there's a secret society for film lovers right here at the Next Reel family of film podcasts, all proud members of the True Story FM network, and you don't have to give any blood or either of your kids?
You've got my attention, Andy. What can you tell me about this cinematic brotherhood?
When you become a member of the Next Reel family, you gain access to a treasure trove of exclusive content, early episode releases, and a community of passionate film enthusiasts who share your love for movies. It's like being initiated into a secret order where you're privy to the inner workings of our shows, including the Next Reel, the Film Board, Movies We Like, Sitting in the Dark, and CinemaScope.
But Andy, as a member, will I unlock a world of bonus content from extended conversations and behind-the-scenes insights to exclusive pre-show and post-show discussions that expand the conversations about the films we love?
Why, yes, the true power of this secret society lies in its community. As a member, you'll join an exclusive group within our Discord community where you can engage in clandestine conversations with other passionate film fans in our members-only channels.
But what about live recordings, Andy? The sacred rituals of any good cinematic order. Will these episodes be scheduled in advance so that members like me will know when to gather around the virtual pyre in real time via YouTube?
Ah, yes. Perhaps the greatest secret of all is that by becoming a member, you're not just investing in your own entertainment, you're also supporting the tireless work of our independent creators and helping to keep the magic of cinema alive and well. So if you're ready to join this elite group of film lovers and unlock the secrets of cinema, head over to truestory.fm/join. For just $5 a month or $55 a year, you will gain access to a world of exclusive content, engaging discussions, and a community that shares your passion for movies. Head to truestory.fm/join to sign up.
Andy, I can't wait for you to welcome me into the inner circle of the Next Reel family of film podcasts. I'll see you in the secret chambers. Now, when do I get my ring?
Well, we don't actually offer rings with your membership.
Tattoos or brands? When can I do that?
No tattoos.
Secret handshakes?
Tell you what, you and I can come up with our own secret handshake, okay?
No, I mean, at the very least. Andy, according to my friend Internet, this is what Letterboxd is. Letterboxd is a global social network for grassroots film discussion and discovery. Use it as a diary to record and share your opinion about films as you watch them, or just keep track of films you've seen in the past. Showcase your favorites on your profile page.
That is a lot.
You bet it is. That's why I want you to tell our fair listeners just one thing you do with Letterboxd that has changed the way you watch movies. Let them have it.
Okay, are you ready for this?
So ready.
I love lists. As of today, I have 246 lists in my account. I use them to track the movies I watch, organize them in all sorts of different ways. I track them by hand. I clone lists from other people. I use them to plan what I'm going to be watching, all sorts of things. I love creating lists. It's a fantastic tool.
Sexiest animated characters. Andy, what is this?
We love Letterboxd, and if you're a movie lover, we are sure you will too. And when you upgrade from the free account, you will remove ads and support the great Kiwi team building this amazing service.
Just use the discount code NEXTREEL or visit thenextreel.com/letterboxd to get 20% off your pro or patron membership. And it works for renewals as well.